Have you ever heard of the Moon Sisters? Well, if you look up at the night sky now, you'll only see a single moon. But legend says that a long, long time ago, there were once 3 moons in Teyvat, named Aria, Sonnet, and Canon. They were sisters and the sovereigns of the night sky, taking turns driving a silver lunar chariot across the heavens. These sisters once blessed the union between one of their Seelie brethren and an unknown traveler from afar within the halls of their lunar palace. But shortly after this, a great calamity struck. The sisters turned on each other, 2 of them crumbling to dust that fell to the earth, and the third still lingered in the sky. Whether that last remaining moon is alive or dead remains to be seen. Now, the Seelie and the traveler they married fled the calamity for a time, but it soon caught up with them, and they were forced to separate, losing their memories in the process. As for the rest of the Seelie race, they began to fade away until they were nothing more than ghostly wisps. But here's the thing. All we have to work with when it comes to the Moon Sisters are legends. There are no historical records, no personal accounts, no real hard evidence that there ever really were 3 moons in the sky, and that this is what happened to them. The only real reference we have to them right now that isn't steeped in myth or legend comes from the Staff of Scarlet Sands. And all that account says is that the number of the moons should be 3, but it doesn't say anything else. There's no details on the calamity, no talk of the sisters, no nothing. And this is what makes the disappearance of the Moon Sisters and the fall of the Seelie race all the more fascinating. So, today, in this video, I want to make an attempt at putting together a prehistoric Teyvatian timeline to pinpoint exactly when the moons fell, and possibly why. As per usual, you can find links for further reading down in the description box below, including links to where you can read all of the different variations of the Moon Sister legends. And you can also find notes and corrections for this video in the pinned comment. Also, this video kind of assumes that you've been paying at least a little bit of attention to world and story quests that happen outside of the main story and Archon quests. If you haven't been, then you might find this video a wee bit difficult to follow, because I'm not going to stop and explain every single little detail. You can check the links in the description for that. Anyway, you were warned. So, let's begin the speculation. In ancient times, the world we now call Teyvat was inhabited by dragons and no humans whatsoever, supposedly. From out of seemingly nowhere, an androgynous winged being known as the Primordial One arrived on Teyvat and promptly went to war with these dragons, seeking to claim this world for itself in order to colonize it and put humans on it. And with the help of its 4 shadows, the Primordial One was able to successfully conquer the land, forcing the dragons into a strategic retreat, as we shall call it. And with the help of its 4 shades, the Primordial One was able to successfully conquer the land, forcing the dragons to submit to their control or to retreat from the surface. But the dragons hadn't given up hope of turning the tide of battle. The Dragon King Nibelung left the surface in search of what we now call forbidden knowledge, believing that it was the key to victory against the Primordial One. But while the Dragon King was busy hunting for forbidden knowledge, the Primordial One began to prepare the land for humans, throwing down spikes that we call celestial nails, and those completely transformed the landscape. The entire realm of Sumeru, for example, used to be a lush rainforest, and not just this small part. It took 1 celestial nail to turn this entire area into a vast desert. Now, I realize that my phrasing makes it sound like the Dragon King and the Primordial One never fought each other, but it's very possible that they did. In fact, it could have happened multiple times. Our only real source of information on this particular incident comes from Apep, and she's a little bit vague. She also has a line that says he returned, and I'm not sure if that means he returned from acquiring forbidden knowledge, or he returned from the dead, or both. Because up to this point, we'd never heard of a singular ultimate Dragon King, which means his presence is either hidden or secret, or that he's just straight up dead. Anyway, regardless, all of this should have occurred more than 6,000 years ago, because that's the first solid date that we have in the timeline, as it is the approximate age of Zhongli. We know that he descended to Teyvat when he was still very young, and then raised a mountain which attracted humans. This means that by the time he was in Teyvat, humans had already been created, but that couldn't have happened until after the war with the dragons was mostly over. Now you'll notice that I have not mentioned any moons yet, and that's because there are no moons mentioned in any of our non-legendary sources of historical information, as I mentioned earlier. However, what we do know is that the Seelies were created by the Primordial One to guide humanity, and humanity was created by the Primordial One as well, presumably. And the Seelies also appear to be of a lower rank than the Moon Sisters, meaning that the Moon Sisters must have been affiliated with the Primordial One. This logic has led to the popular theory that at least 3 of the Primordial One's shades were actually the Moon Sisters themselves. It's either that or there were 4 shades and 3 moons, which would make for a total of 7 divine beings that would rule the heavens, and that kind of fits in with Teyvat's whole cycle of 7 rulers, right? 7 dragon sovereigns, 7 archons. Makes sense to have 7 Primordial One subsidiaries, whatever that would be called. Both are equally possible. But because things are still kind of up in the air, I don't want to talk about Istaroth at all because she's only ever really been identified as a shade, and I don't want to get into the debate about whether or not she's also a moon, okay? Okay, getting back on track. At this point in time, about 6,000 years ago for the record, the dragons were still in hiding, humans had just been brought into the world, Seelies had been created to guide them, and there were also 3 moon sisters who may or may not have been 3 of the 4 Primordial One's shadows. Got all that? Good. Now the second oldest date that we have on record is 3,700 years ago, a date that marks the foundation of Liyue Harbor, the death of Guizhong, and the fall of the Guili Assembly, and also it's the earliest mention of the Archon War. According to the book Before Sun and Moon, the period between 6,000 and 3,700 years ago should have been the era of the unified civilization, and it was an era of prosperity and peace. Well, for the humans, I mean. The dragons were screwed and kind of in hiding at this point. Anyway, also in the book Before Sun and Moon is a passage that marks the end of the unified civilization, which happened roughly when the invaders from beyond the firmament came and incited a second war that was likened only to the war between the Primordial One and the dragons. These invaders are known only as the Second Throne or the Second Who Came. That is the same war that caused Enkanomiya to sink beneath the sea. This is where the records of Before Sun and Moon end and where we have to start looking at other sources, like the Flowers of Paradise Lost artifact set. In that set, it says that the Second Throne brought with it a natural phenomenon that sounds a whole lot like forbidden knowledge to me. To be clear, what it really says is that the invaders brought with them destruction, plagues, and illusions that could break through the shackles of the land, and then it continues to call it the rising tide of delusion. Now, forbidden knowledge, in contrast, is also referred to as a plague in some cases, and in the case of Deshret, it was rather liquid visually, and it drove people insane, so there's the rising tide of delusion. You see what I'm getting at here, right? Well, anyway, this disaster the Second Throne brought with it tore the earth asunder, and in order to heal the land, the Primordial One threw down even more of their celestial nails that they used to terraform the earth and fight back the dragons at the beginning of time. And you may recall that the dark mud in the chasm, which can be repelled by the celestial nails, is actually stabilized forbidden knowledge. So I feel pretty confident linking the forbidden knowledge to whatever it was that the invaders or the Second Throne brought with them. Now, it's curious to me that they say invaders came from beyond the firmament, so the Sky Dome, but also that the plagues they brought with them are basically just forbidden knowledge, because forbidden knowledge is what the Dragon King was pursuing, making it very plausible that the Second Throne was someone affiliated with the Dragon King or the Dragon King himself. Whatever the case, the important thing here is that there were 2 instances where the Primordial One threw down celestial nails, once in the very, very beginning, pre-6,000 years ago, and once when the Second Throne came. Now, during the time when the Second Throne arrived, one of these celestial nails hit the mountain that we call Dragonspine and destroyed a sacred tree there, causing the entire fertile mountain and Solvindignir civilization to be encased in an endless winter. This is a very important thing because the civilization of Dragonspine had regular contact with the envoys of heaven, which we call the Seelies, but after the nail fell, they never heard from those envoys again. Now, we know from all of these legends surrounding the Moon Sisters and the Goddess of Flowers, who we will talk about in a minute, that the Seelies all withered away when the moons died. So if this is the last recorded instance of the Seelies interacting with humans, then this must be around the time when the moons died. This means that the moons died in the war with the Second Throne. And this is so important because we have multiple myths that say the Moon Sisters turned on each other, and we also know that the forbidden knowledge can drive people insane. And if the Second Throne really did leverage forbidden knowledge like it seems they did, then it's very possible that the forbidden knowledge was responsible for the moons fighting against each other and also their fall. And that also means that forbidden knowledge was responsible for wiping out the entire race of Seelies, which is frightening. But anyway, back to the timeline. Now remember, this should have happened pretty close to that 3,700 year mark, within, a few hundred years of that or so, if I had to guess. And there was one other really important event that happened around that time. While it is true that most of the Seelies lost their physical forms during this time, there was one very important survivor that we know of as the Goddess of Flowers. Curiously, she says she was exiled from heaven, and she was forbidden to look back upon it, which makes you wonder if the Primordial One was wary of her or any of the other Seelies becoming infected with forbidden knowledge and becoming a threat. In any case, she miraculously was able to keep her physical form and ended up wandering the desert for 72 nights. She had to have been alone in the desert for long enough to not only create an entire race of the Jinn, but also to create the city of Tule-Tula before meeting and becoming friends with both Deshret and Rukkhadevata. And yes, this event had to have happened a short while before the 3,700 years ago mark, because the 3,700 years ago mark is the earliest mention we have of the Archon War. And Deshret was offered a gnosis from Celestia, which was supposed to be one of the prizes of the Archon War. And it was offered to him while he was friends with both Rukkhadevata and the Goddess of Flowers. That 3,700 years ago mark is really starting to become a very important date, don't you think? And now I'm gonna make it even more important. You see, not long after the Celestial Nail fell on Dragonspine, there was a message left behind by a scribe who talks about a rumor they've heard about a civilization being built without any gods, and they believed that that nation had the power to stand up against the order of this world. And if it wasn't obvious, yeah, they're talking about Khaenri'ah. But that means that the establishment of Khaenri'ah would have happened roughly around the fall of the Celestial Nail and Dragonspine, which should have only fallen during the war with the Second Throne, which should have happened a few hundred years before 3,700 years ago. So, maybe 4,000 years ago. Because we have to assume that Khaenri'ah is pretty well established by the 3,700 year mark, because that's when Guizhong died. And we know that Guizhong was fascinated by the technology of Khaenri'ah because she has ruin guards in her own personal domain where she studied them. She would capture them and study them. That means that Khaenri'ah must have been established somewhere between the arrival of the Second Throne and the fall of the Guili Assembly when Guizhong died 3,700 years ago. That's why I gave it the 4,000 year mark. And when you really stop to think about it, this placement in the timeline starts to make a lot of sense. Because it didn't make much sense why Khaenri'ah would hate the gods so much if the gods work in favor of humans unless they witnessed some kind of event that broke their trust in the gods. I would imagine that the events and the war following the arrival of the Second Throne to have brought with it some unsavory revelations, enough so that Khaenri'ah would retreat underground and build a nation where gods could not reach them, all while building an army of machines to protect their people from the monsters of the abyss and from the gods themselves. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that I believe the Second Throne rose up against Celestia and the Primordial One about 4,000 years ago, and that was the event that destroyed the moons, killed the Seelies, sank Enkanomiya, destroyed Dragonspine, and inspired the people of Khaenri'ah to build a nation without gods. I also believe that these events led to the Archon War because it just makes sense in context. We know what forbidden knowledge can do to people. We know what it can do to dragons, and if my speculation is correct, we know it has the power to destroy beings as powerful as the Moon Sisters. And both Deshret and Nibelung believe that forbidden knowledge itself could defeat even the Primordial One. So put yourself in the Primordial One's position for a minute. 3 of your subordinates are corrupted or dead, an entire legion of your Seelies is wiped out, and the land is filled with poison. It wouldn't be long before that forbidden knowledge, even after you've suppressed it with the celestial nails, made its way into the systems of the demon gods like Osail and Guizhong, corrupting them and causing wide-scale destruction. Or maybe that's what was already happening. Maybe, for example, Decarabian wasn't misguided when he barricaded himself and the people of Old Mondstadt inside of a wind barrier. Maybe he was infected by forbidden knowledge and it made him paranoid or drunk on power. Maybe Bachao, Osail, and the Che were all corrupted. Maybe Guizhong was too, and that's why the Yaksha had to seal her away, watching her turn into stone, not unlike the petrified rift wolves in the desert. And maybe the purpose of the Archon War was more of a necessity. Only the strongest and purest of the demon gods were left, the ones who loved humans the most, while the rest were merely liabilities in the struggle against the pull of forbidden knowledge. It's a pretty interesting thing to think about. But hey, what do I know? This is all just a theory. Again. No, I won't say it. I will not give you the satisfaction. I won't do it. In fact, I'm gonna go. That's it. That's all I've got for today. So thank you all so much for watching, and a very special thank you to all of my beautiful channel members who have been so patient with me while I slowly lose my mind at my day job, which is currently using my butt as its own personal punching bag. I am in pain. But if you have thoughts on the timeline or what might have happened to the moon, let me know. Leave a comment or, whatever it is the cool kids do these days. I'm gonna go get some ice for my butt. It really hurts. So take care, guys, and I'll see you next time.